4:15 in the morning. The destroyer USS Cole was sliding through the black waters of the Strait of Hormuz at a steady 15 knots. The ship, known by its designation Destroyer DDG-67, was navigating the world's most congested maritime chokepoint with its navigation lights dimmed, and its crew at a state of modified battle stations. Something was waiting in the deep, silent channel of the strait that the ship's powerful ANSPY-1 radar could not detect. The air over the Persian Gulf was thick and heavy, carrying the sharp mineral scent of salt spray mixed with the faint, sweet smell of crude oil from a passing supertanker. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, casting a pale and shivering light across the surface of the water, which remained as flat and dark as polished obsidian. Below the waterline, the hull of the USS Cole vibrated, with the rhythmic pulse of its gas turbine engines, a sound that masked the approach of a predator. Inside the sonar shack, a single technician sat in the dim blue glow of his multifunction display. He wore heavy headphones, his eyes tracking the scrolling green lines of the passive sonar waterfall. For 3 hours, the acoustic environment had been dominated by the low-frequency thrum of merchant traffic. Then, at exactly 4:17 in the morning, the technician heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sharp, mechanical clack-whir of a torpedo tube opening, followed immediately by the high-pitched, metallic scream of a high-speed propeller. "Torpedo in the water!" the technician shouted, his voice cracking with sudden adrenaline. "Bearing 090. High speed, range 600 yards and closing." On the bridge, the officer of the deck did not hesitate. He ordered the helm to hard starboard and signaled for flank speed, the narrowest possible profile to the incoming threat. The 4 gas turbine engines of the USS Cole roared to life. The ship, shuddering, began to churn the sea. But at a distance of less than 600 yards, physics was on the side of the attacker. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine, the Tarek, had been sitting on the bottom of the strait in silent ambush for 12 hours. It had launched 2 wake-homing torpedoes, each carrying 500 pounds of high-explosive warheads. These weapons did not look for the sound of the ship. They looked for the massive turbulence created by the destroyer's propellers. The first torpedo struck at 4:18 in the morning. It punched through the port side of the hull, just below the waterline at frame 180, near the auxiliary engine room. The detonation was not a single sound, but a massive, bone-jarring slam that felt like the entire ship had been dropped onto solid concrete. From a height of 20 meters, the explosion ripped a hole in the steel plate 6 meters wide. The pressure wave was so intense that it shattered light fixtures and sent sailors in their bunks flying toward the overhead. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo followed. It was guided by the chaos of the first explosion, driving directly into the jagged hole opened by its predecessor. This second detonation occurred deep within the ship's interior. The combined force of the 2 warheads shredded the auxiliary machinery and tore through the bulkheads of the nearby berthing areas. A geyser of white water, black diesel oil, and jagged metal fragments erupted from the side of the ship, rising 30 meters into the air before crashing back down onto the deck. The USS Cole immediately took a heavy list of 8 degrees to port. The air inside the ship was instantly replaced by a thick, choking fog of pulverized insulation, fuel vapors, and the acrid, chemical stink of burnt high explosives. On the bridge, the commanding officer fought to stay upright as the deck tilted beneath his feet. The internal communication systems were dead. The primary lighting had failed, replaced by the eerie, pulsing red of the emergency battle lanterns. "Damage Control Central, report," into his headset, but he was met only with static and the distant, terrifying sound of rushing water. Below decks, the situation was a nightmare of twisted steel and rising floodwaters. In the auxiliary engine room, sailors were chest-deep in a mixture of seawater and fuel oil within 2 minutes of the impact. They worked in near-total darkness, using handheld flashlights to identify the source of the leaks. The heat from the initial blast had been so intense that it had melted the aluminum ladders, forcing men to scramble over jagged debris to escape the rising tide. the ship's executive officer took charge of the main deck, organizing a bucket brigade and deploying portable pumps. The crew, trained for years for this exact moment, moved with a grim, disciplined efficiency despite the shock. They hammered wooden plugs into small leaks and draped heavy I-beams over buckling bulkheads to prevent a total structural collapse. By 4:30 in the morning, the USS Cole was dead in the water. Smoke continued to pour from the massive wound in its side, drifting lazily toward the Iranian coast. The ship sat low in the water, a broken giant in one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. The silence that followed, the explosions, was heavy and absolute, broken only by the frantic splashing of water against the hull and the distant, rhythmic wail of the ship's emergency alarms. The United States Navy had just lost its primary surface combatant in the Strait of Hormuz. The war had begun before the sun had even touched the horizon. 4:45 in the morning. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, leading Carrier Strike Group 12, was operating 300 miles to the south in the Arabian Sea when the flash message arrived. Within 60 seconds of the confirmation that the USS Cole had been struck, the entire strike group transitioned from a state of heightened readiness to active combat operations. The flight deck of the massive nuclear-powered carrier erupted into a controlled storm of activity as the first wave of search and rescue assets prepared for immediate launch. The air on the flight deck was cold and whipped into a frenzy by the twin rotors of two MH-60 Sierra helicopters, their engines screaming as they reached full power. The smell of burning jet fuel and ozone hung heavy in the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by the rhythmic flashing of yellow and green lights from the deck crew. Beyond the edge of the ship, the Arabian Sea was a churning mass of white foam, reflecting the urgency of a superpower that had just been bloodied in a surprise attack. At 5 in the morning, the two MH-60 Sierra helicopters lifted off the deck, banking hard toward the north. They were escorted by 4 FA-18 Super Hornet fighters, each armed with a full complement of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and AGM-88 HARM missiles. Their mission was twofold: to extract the critically wounded from the listing destroyer and to provide a protective umbrella against any Iranian forces attempting to interfere with the rescue. 100 miles to the north, the destroyer DDG-51 USS Arleigh Burke was already sprinting toward the last known coordinates of the USS Cole at a speed of 32 knots. The ship's 4 gas turbine engines were pushed to their maximum operating limits, leaving a massive white wake that stretched for miles behind it. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Arleigh Burke, the atmosphere was one of cold, professional fury, as technicians monitored the surrounding airspace for any signs of further Iranian aggression. The rescue helicopters reached the USS Cole at 5:50 in the morning, just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon. The sight that greeted the pilots was grim. The destroyer was trailing a plume of black smoke that stretched 5 miles downwind, and the ship was listing heavily to the port side, its decks slick with a mixture of seawater and oil. Despite the damage, the American flag still flew from the mast, a defiant symbol amidst the wreckage of the Strait of Hormuz. The first search and rescue swimmer dropped into the water at 5:55 in the morning. He fought through a 2-meter swell to reach a life raft containing 12 sailors who had been blown overboard by the initial blast. The swimmer, a second-class petty officer, worked with mechanical precision, securing the injured into rescue litters as the helicopter hovered 30 feet above the churning water. The downwash from the rotors sprayed salt and debris into the air, making visibility nearly impossible. Yet the extraction continued without a single pause. By 6:30 in the morning, 15 critically injured sailors had been winched into the helicopters and were being flown back to the medical facilities aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. On the deck of the Cole, the remaining crew continued their desperate fight to save their ship. They had managed to stabilize the list at 10 degrees, but the internal flooding remained a constant threat to the structural integrity of the hull. The air inside the lower decks was still thick with the acrid stench of burnt plastic and copper, making every breath a struggle for the damage control teams. As the rescue operations proceeded, the United States Fifth Fleet began its systematic buildup for retaliation. To the east, two Virginia-class fast-attack submarines moved into silent patrol positions outside the Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas. In the air, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft took its station at 30,000 feet, its massive radar dome scanning every square inch of the Iranian coastline. The electronic order of battle was being mapped with surgical precision, identifying every radar site, every missile battery, and every command center that had supported the strike on the Cole. The Iranian Navy attempted to test the American resolve at 7:15 in the morning. A formation of 5 fast attack craft emerged from the coastal islands, moving at 40 knots toward the rescue site. They were immediately intercepted by the 4 FA-18 fighters circling overhead. The American pilots did not fire, but they performed a series of low-altitude, high-speed passes directly over the Iranian boats, the sonic booms shattering the windows of the small vessels and forcing them to turn back toward the safety of the coast. By 8 in the morning, the USS Arleigh Burke had arrived on the scene and took up a defensive station 500 yards from the crippled USS Cole. The two ships were now linked by more than just proximity. They were the focal point of a massive military machine that was rapidly shifting from defense to offense. The commander of the Fifth Fleet, operating from the headquarters in Bahrain, issued the first set of targeting orders to the strike group. The time for rescue was transitioning into the time for a calculated, overwhelming response. The crew of the USS Cole had held the line through the darkest hours of the morning. Now, as the sun rose fully over the Persian Gulf, they watched as the horizon filled with the silhouettes of the most powerful navy in the world. The first phase of the campaign was over, and the price paid by the United States had been recorded. The second phase would ensure that the price paid by the attacker would be significantly higher. 8:30 in the morning. Inside the windowless, high-security vault of the Naval Forces Central Command headquarters in Bahrain, the atmosphere was one of calculated, cold-blooded analysis. Analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence and the National Security Agency were huddled around glowing displays, synthesizing a mountain of data that had been gathered in the 4 hours since the attack. On the destroyer DDG-67, every sensor in the region, from deep space satellites to underwater acoustic arrays, was being exploited to strip away the enemy's anonymity. The primary piece of evidence was the acoustic recording recovered from the wreckage of the USS Cole. Before the power had failed, the ship's sonar system had captured a high-fidelity signature of the attacking submarine. In the world of undersea warfare, every vessel has a unique sound profile created by its propeller blades, its motor bearings, and even the flow of water over its hull. The analysts compared this recording against a massive database of Iranian naval assets. Within 12 minutes, the identification was absolute. The attacker was the Terek, a Russian-built Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine belonging to the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy. The air in the command center smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the high-stakes digital war being waged. On the screens, satellite imagery from a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite passing over the Persian Gulf at an altitude of 250 kilometers provided the second piece of the puzzle. Thermal infrared sensors had detected a heat bloom near the naval base at Bandar Abbas 6 hours prior, consistent with a submarine clearing its ballast tanks and departing for a combat patrol. The timeline matched the transit distance to the Strait of Hormuz perfectly. At 9 in the morning, the findings were briefed to the National Security Council in Washington. The President of the United States, joined by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reviewed the evidence in the White House Situation Room. The decision was immediate. The unprovoked sinking of a United States sovereign vessel required a response that would not only neutralize the immediate threat, but also dismantle the infrastructure that made such an attack possible. The President signed the authorization for Operation Vigilant Cohort, a multi-phase campaign designed to achieve total maritime dominance in the region. The campaign was structured into 4 distinct tactical phases. Phase 1 focused on the immediate neutralization of the submarine Tariq and its sister ships. Phase 2 involved the suppression of Iranian coastal defense cruise missile batteries that threatened the strait. Phase 3 was the systematic destruction of the naval command and control infrastructure at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr. The final phase was the clearing of any minefields laid by the Iranian forces to ensure the free flow of global commerce. To execute Phase 1, the United States Navy deployed its most advanced anti-submarine warfare platform, the Pate Poseidon. 2 of these aircraft, based out of Naval Air Station Sigonella, but forward deployed to the region, were already in the air. Each Pate Poseidon was a converted Boeing 737 airframe packed with millions of dollars of sensors, including the AN/APY-10 maritime surveillance radar and a sophisticated sonobuoy launch system. They began a systematic mowing the lawn pattern over the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, dropping hundreds of acoustic sensors into the water to create a digital net. At 9:45 in the morning, the Pate Poseidon aircraft began receiving signals from the sonobuoy field. The ocean floor in the strait is rugged, filled with canyons and rock formations that a clever submarine commander can use to hide. However, the United States Navy had spent decades mapping these waters. The analysts in Bahrain used the high-bandwidth data link known as Link 16 to share the underwater map with the entire strike group. This allowed every ship and aircraft in the area to see a real-time, 3-dimensional picture of the underwater battlefield. The logistics of the operation were also being finalized. Thousands of tons of precision-guided munitions were being readied at depots in Diego Garcia and Qatar. C-17 Globemaster transport planes were already in flight, carrying specialized spare parts and additional medical teams to support the fleet. The United States military was not just preparing for a single strike. It was spooling up a massive, self-sustaining engine of war that would remain in place until the objective was met. By 10:30 in the morning, the hunt had narrowed. The Pate Poseidon had detected a faint, rhythmic cavitation sound at coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 56 degrees 20 minutes east. It was the sound of a submarine trying to move at very low speed to conserve battery power. The Tariq was still in the area, likely waiting to see if it could find another target in the confusion. It did not realize that the confusion had ended, replaced by a relentless and invisible pursuit. The commanding officer of the USS Arleigh Burke, currently escorting the crippled Cole, received the target coordinates via a secure satellite channel. He looked at the display in the Combat Information Center and felt a grim satisfaction. The predator had become the prey. The rules of engagement were now weapons-free for any confirmed hostile underwater contact. The hunt was over, and the kill was about to begin. 11 in the morning. The midday sun was a white-hot disk overhead, turning the surface of the Strait of Hormuz into a blinding sheet of hammered silver. The air was thick with a shimmering heat haze that distorted the horizon, but the sensors of the United States Navy saw through the mirage with digital clarity. The search for the Iranian Kilo-class submarine had evolved from a wide-area hunt into a localized, suffocating strangulation. A coordinated screen of anti-submarine warfare assets had established a 30-mile-wide kill box around the last known position of the Tariq. At the center of this effort were 2 MH-60 Romeo Seahawk helicopters launched from the cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal. The helicopters hovered just 50 feet above the water, their rotors kicking up a constant, fine mist of salt spray that coated the airframes in a white crust. The pilots struggled against the settling with power effect caused by the stagnant, 100-degree air, but they held their stations with professional precision. From the belly of the lead MH-60 Romeo, a thick, braided cable unspooled, lowering the AN/AQS-22 dipping sonar into the depths. This sensor, a sophisticated transducer known as a reeling machine, descended 100 meters below the surface, passing through the thermal layer, where the water temperature dropped sharply. Below this layer, the sonar operator in the back of the helicopter could see much farther as the cold water acted as a conduit for sound. The operator, a sonar technician, second class, sat in a cramped, darkened cabin that smelled of hydraulic fluid and recycled air. He adjusted the gain on his display, sending out a ping, a high-frequency burst of acoustic energy. The sound traveled through the water at 1,500 meters per second, struck the rocky floor of the strait, and bounced back. Among the echoes of rocks and wrecks, he was looking for a specific, metallic return, the hard hit of a submarine's steel hull. Dipping 3, pinging active. The operator announced over the secure radio net, "I have a faint return. Bearing 185, range 4,000 yards. It looks like a stationary contact shadowed against the canyon wall." High above the helicopters, the Pate Poseidon maintained its orbit at 5,000 feet. The crew of the Pate acted as the quarterback for the engagement, fusing data from the dipping sonar with the signals from a line of 32 sonobuoys. They had dropped in a linear pattern across the strait. These sonobuoys, designated as the ANSSQ-110 series, were small, cylindrical tubes that floated on the surface, dangling hydrophones into the deep. They created an acoustic fence that the turret could not cross without being detected. The environment beneath the surface was a chaotic symphony of noise. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the loudest underwater environments in the world, filled with the grinding of tectonic plates, the clicking of shrimp, and the distant, low-frequency thrum of hundreds of merchant ships. To find a silent submarine in this mess was like trying to hear a single heartbeat in the middle of a thunderstorm. Yet, the United States Navy's signal processors were designed for exactly this task. They filtered out the clutter of the ocean, leaving only the man-made signatures. At 11:30 in the morning, the Pate Poseidon detected a change in the acoustic field. The stationary contact at the canyon wall had begun to move. The Terek was likely running low on oxygen or battery capacity, forced to transition from its silent ambush position to a slow-speed crawl. As its electric motors turned the large, 7-bladed propeller, it created a series of harmonic-specific frequencies that were as unique as a fingerprint. "Contact is confirmed hostile," the mission commander aboard the Pate reported. "Acoustic signature matches Kilo-class submarine Terek. Target is moving west-southwest at 4 knots. Depth 60 meters." The news was flashed instantly to the USS Arleigh Burke, which was now less than 10 miles from the contact. The ship's commanding officer ordered the Mark 32 surface vessel torpedo tubes to be trained to the firing bearing. On the deck of the cruiser, sailors readied the Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes, checking the thermal batteries and the guidance logic. These weapons were smart torpedoes, capable of independent hunting once they hit the water. The Iranian commander in the Terek was surely aware that the net was closing. Every ping from the dipping sonar would have sounded like a hammer striking the hull of his submarine, a terrifying reminder that he was being tracked by an invisible and relentless enemy. He had two choices: surface and surrender, or attempt to fight his way out of the circle. In the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Admiral watched the digital icons move across the large screen display. He knew that the next few minutes would determine the fate of the submarine that had crippled the USS Cole. The rules of engagement had been satisfied. The target was identified. The assets were in place. The United States Navy was no longer searching. It was ready to strike. 12:15 in the afternoon. The Strait of Hormuz was a pressure cooker of heat and electronic tension. At coordinates 26 degrees 42 minutes north, 56 degrees 18 minutes east, the destroyer DDG-51, USS Arleigh Burke, turned its bow directly toward the acoustic contact. The ship's sonar technicians had moved from passive tracking to active pinging, sending continuous pulses of high-energy sound that hammered against the steel hull of the submerged Iranian submarine. There was no longer any need for stealth. The time for the kill had arrived. The air on the deck of the Arleigh Burke was dry and carried the faint, metallic scent of heated electronics and the salt crust of the Persian Gulf. In the Combat Information Center, the commanding officer watched the glowing tactical display. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine, Terek, was no longer trying to hide. Realizing it was trapped in shallow water, the submarine increased speed to 8 knots, its propeller blades beginning to cavitate, creating bubbles that popped with the sound of small explosions in the water, making its position even more obvious to the American sensors. The trigger was squeezed. From the port side, Mark 32 torpedo tubes, a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo, shrieked off the rack, propelled by a burst of high-pressure air that sent a cloud of white spray 10 meters into the air. The weapon hit the water with a heavy splash and immediately activated its internal liquid propellant engine. The high-pitched scream of the torpedo's propeller ripped through the water, a sound of mechanical death traveling at 40 knots. Beneath the surface, the turret detected the incoming threat and reacted with the desperation of a cornered animal. The submarine's commander ordered a snapshot, launching a single TEST-71 heavy torpedo on a reciprocal bearing toward the American destroyer, while simultaneously ejecting a cloud of acoustic decoys meant to confuse the Mark 54. The Mark 54 torpedo ignored the decoys, its onboard computer filtering out the false signals to stay locked on the massive steel bulk of the submarine. It punched straight through the outer casing of the Tariq near the forward torpedo room. The 500 pounds of high explosive detonated with a muffled, earth-shaking thud that sent a massive shockwave through the water, slamming against the hull of the Arleigh Burke 2 miles away. The explosion blew a jagged, 3-meter hole through both the outer and inner hulls of the submarine. Inside the Tariq, the sudden pressure change was catastrophic, crushing the chests of the crewmen in the forward compartments instantly, as thousands of tons of seawater surged into the vessel. The Iranian submarine lurked for a moment in the water, its nose dipping down as the weight of the flooding took hold. The crew in the stern attempted to blow the emergency ballast tanks, sending a frantic geyser of compressed air and white foam to the surface, but the damage was too severe. The submarine's electric motors shorted out, in a shower of blue sparks and ozone-heavy smoke, leaving the vessel in total darkness. The Tariq groaned as the internal bulkheads buckled under the immense pressure, and then it slid backward, sinking into the deep rocky trench at the bottom of the strait. The Iranian torpedo, deprived of guidance from its parent ship, veered off course and exploded harmlessly against a rock formation 3 miles to the south. A massive plume of black diesel oil and debris erupted onto the surface, spreading across the silver water in a shimmering, toxic slick. For exactly 5 seconds, there was a dead silence on the radio channels, as the American sonar operators listened to the breaking up noises of the dying submarine. Then, the silence was replaced by the cold, professional voice of the Arleigh Burke's tactical action officer confirming the kill. The primary threat to the surface fleet had been neutralized, but the surface of the Gulf remained littered with the floating wreckage of life vests and wooden crates, the only remnants of the vessel that had started the war. The destruction of the Tariq was the first kinetic victory for Operation Vigilant Cohort, but it was far from the end of the engagement. The American strike group did not pause to celebrate. Even as the oil slick spread, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye overhead was already vectoring FA-18 fighters toward new targets along the coast. The Iranian military had used a submarine to strike first, and the United States had responded by erasing that submarine from the order of battle. The strategic focus now shifted from the depths of the sea to the hardened concrete bunkers and missile batteries lining the Iranian shore. The admiral aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford received the confirmation of the kill at 12:25 in the afternoon. He stood at the window of the flag bridge, looking out over the rows of aircraft being fueled and armed. The elimination of the Tariq had cleared the way for the heavier elements of the strike group to move closer to the coast. The ASW screen had done its job, and the protective bubble around the fleet was now secure. Now, the full weight of the United States Navy would be brought to bear on the infrastructure that had enabled the attack on the USS Cole, 1:30 in the afternoon. The fast combat support ship, USNS Supply, was already holding a steady course of 090 degrees, slicing through the deep blue swells of the North Arabian Sea. This massive vessel, displacing nearly 50,000 tons, was the moving heart of the strike group's endurance. Without the fuel, food, and ammunition carried within its cavernous hull, the warships of the United States Navy would be little more than drifting steel islands within 48 hours of high-intensity combat. The air between the USNS Supply and the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. was a chaotic tunnel of wind and noise. Two massive ships were moving in parallel, separated by exactly 180 feet of churning, white-capped water. The sea was running with 3-meter swells that caused the ships to roll in a slow, rhythmic dance, a dangerous physical ballet where a single steering error could result in a catastrophic collision. The iron smell of the sea was masked by the overwhelming stench of diesel exhaust and the sharp, chemical tang of hydraulic fluid. High-tension wires stretched between the two ships, vibrating with the strain of the transfer. These cables carried the span wire, a heavy-duty line that supported the massive rubber hoses used for refueling. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the flow began. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel and DF2 diesel fuel surged through the hoses at a rate of 3,000 gallons per minute. The hoses pulsed like living veins, delivering the lifeblood required to keep the FA-18 fighters in the air and the escorting destroyers' turbines turning. While the fuel flowed, the vertical replenishment phase began. Two CH-53 Kilo King Stallion helicopters hovered over the aft deck of the USNS Supply. The downwash from their massive 7-bladed rotors was a physical force, flattening the spray and making it difficult for the deck crew to stand upright. The crew, wearing color-coded jerseys, yellow for plane directors, green for maintenance, and red for ordnance, worked with a practiced, frantic speed. They attached heavy nylon slings to wooden pallets, stacked with crates of Mark 82 500-pound bombs and Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs. Each helicopter lifted a 2-ton load of high explosives, banking sharply away from the supply ship and flying the short distance to the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. The pilots operated with inches of clearance, battling the turbulent air currents created by the movement of the two ships. Over the course of 3 hours, the helicopters made over 100 trips, transferring 250 tons of precision-guided munitions. This was the iron flow that would soon be converted into the kinetic fire required to dismantle the Iranian coastal defenses. Beneath the flight deck, inside the hangar bay of the carrier, the logistics chain continued. Sailors used electric forklifts to move the pallets into high-speed weapons elevators. These elevators descended deep into the ship's magazines, where ordnance technicians began the meticulous process of building the bombs. They attached GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack Munition Guidance Kits to the steel bodies of the bombs, turning dumb iron into satellite-guided precision weapons. The air in the hangar was hot and stagnant, filled with the sound of pneumatic wrenches and the focused chatter of men and women who knew that the success of the next strike depended on their mechanical accuracy. The logistics effort also addressed the human cost of the conflict. A V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft landed on the supply ship's primary pad, carrying fresh medical supplies, 3,000 pints of Type O negative blood, and specialized surgical equipment. These supplies were destined for the primary medical ward of the carrier, which had been expanded to handle the casualties from the USS Cole. The logistics of war were not just about bullets and fuel. They were about the sustainment of the sailors who fought the machines. By 4 in the afternoon, the underway replenishment was nearly complete. The USNS Supply had transferred 1 million gallons of fuel and nearly 400 pallets of dry goods and ammunition. The heavy hoses were disconnected, the couplings snapping back with a spray of residual fuel that was quickly washed away by the deck crews. The tension wires were winched back into their housings, and the two ships began to drift apart, their wakes crossing in a turbulent X pattern as they resumed their combat formations. The USNS Supply turned south, heading back toward the deep-water port at Salalah to reload its own empty holds. It would be back within 72 hours. Behind it, the USS Gerald R. and its escorts were now fully topped off, their magazines full and their fuel tanks brimming. The strike group was no longer just a defensive screen. It was a fully fueled, fully armed weapon of national power, ready to project force across the horizon. The logistics phase had been executed with the silent, professional efficiency that is the hallmark of the United States Navy. There were no explosions in this part of the campaign, no dramatic dogfights, and no sonar pings. But the iron flow had ensured that when the order to attack was finally given, the United States forces would have the overwhelming weight of fire necessary to end the conflict on their own terms. 5:45 in the afternoon. The Gulf of Oman. Cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal was holding a steady station, 50 miles off the Iranian coast, its Aegis combat system fully integrated with the rest of the strike group. The ship's Mark 41 vertical launch system was already programmed with 64 separate target coordinates, each one representing a critical node in the enemy's coastal defense network. The air was cooling as the sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple and casting long, jagged shadows across the whitecaps of the Arabian Sea. The order to commence Phase 2 of Operation Vigilant Cohort arrived via a flash priority message from Pacific Command. The objective was the total blinding of the Iranian coastal radar and long-range surveillance sites. These eyes were the primary threat to American aircraft, providing the early warning necessary for Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries to engage incoming strikes. To destroy them, the United States Navy would utilize the Tomahawk cruise missile, a weapon capable of hugging the terrain at subsonic speeds to evade detection until the final seconds of its flight. At exactly 5:50 in the afternoon, the deck of the Sunny USS Port Royal erupted in a spectacular display of controlled violence. The armored hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system snapped open, and the first Tomahawk cruise missile shrieked into the sky. A massive pillar of orange flame and white smoke punched upward from the deck, the roar of the solid fuel booster rocket vibrating through the steel hull of the cruiser. The smell of burning chemical propellant, sharp and acrid, washed over the bridge windows as the missile climbed to 500 feet before tilting over and heading toward the coast. Within 90 seconds, 32 missiles had been launched from the Port Royal alone. They were joined by another 32 missiles from the destroyer DDG-51 USS Arleigh Burke, and 20 more from a Virginia-class submarine operating submerged in the Arabian Sea. This tide of Tomahawks consisted of 84 missiles in total, all synchronized, to arrive at their various targets within a 60-second window. The sky above the strike group was crisscrossed with white exhaust trails, a digital geometry of destruction etched against the darkening horizon. As the missiles crossed the coastline, they dropped to an altitude of just 30 meters, following the contours of the rugged Iranian terrain. They used a combination of GPS guidance, terrain contour matching, and digital scene mapping area correlation to find their way. The missiles were headed for specific coordinates: 27 degrees 8 minutes north, 56 degrees 12 minutes east, the site of a high-power Russian-made radar at Bandar Abbas. Other missiles were targeted at the coastal missile batteries near Jask and the electronic intelligence stations at Cha Bahar. The Iranian defenders had less than 10 seconds of warning. The Tomahawk cruise missiles appeared on their screens not as a massive formation, but as dozens of tiny, low-flying contacts emerging from the ground clutter. At 6:10 in the evening, the first impacts occurred. A 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead punched through the reinforced concrete bunker of the Bandar Abbas Central Radar Control Room. The resulting explosion turned the interior of the facility into a whirlwind of fire and jagged glass, vaporizing the electronics and killing the operators instantly. 10 miles to the east, 2 more Tomahawks struck a battery of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles. The first missile hit the radar vehicle, its blast wave flipping the 20-ton truck onto its side and igniting the fuel tanks. The second missile struck the launcher itself, causing the 4 massive interceptor missiles to detonate in their canisters. A secondary explosion followed, sending a fireball 300 meters into the air that could be seen by the pilots of the FA-18 fighters circling 50 miles out at sea. By 6:15 in the evening, the blinding of the coast was complete. 78 of the 84 missiles had struck their primary targets with surgical precision. The remaining 6 had been intercepted by short-range point defense fire or had malfunctioned, a 92% success rate that was consistent with the highest standards of American naval professionalism. The Iranian coastal defense network, which had taken 2 decades to build, had been systematically dismantled and backdated, less than 5 minutes of kinetic action. On the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. the aircrew watched the distant flashes of light on the horizon. The Tomahawk Tide had cleared the path. The electronic shield that had protected the Iranian coastline was gone, replaced by a jagged line of burning wreckage and silent radar screens. The air smelled of salt and the cold, thin scent of the coming night. But the atmosphere among the sailors was one of intense, quiet focus. They knew that with the enemy's eyes gone, the next phase would be a direct assault on the heart of the naval infrastructure that had launched the attack on the USS Cole. The admiral in the flag bridge received the damage assessment report. He noted the coordinates of the destroyed sites and ordered the first wave of strike aircraft to launch. The long-range phase of the campaign was over. The close-in battle for the naval base at Bandar Abbas was about to begin. The tide had gone out, and it had taken the enemy's defenses with it. 6:30 in the evening. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. was a beehive of kinetic energy, as 36 FA-18 Super Hornets and 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers prepared for the main strike. The sun had vanished, leaving the Arabian Sea in a deep indigo twilight. The air was charged with the high-frequency whine of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, a sound like a giant whip cracking across the deck. The smell of unburned jet fuel and the heated grease of the catapult tracks was thick in the air, a scent that every sailor on the deck knew as the smell of an impending launch. One by one, the strike fighters were taxied onto the 4 catapults. The shooters in their yellow jerseys gave the signal, and 80,000 pounds of steel and high explosives were hurled into the dark sky at 250 kilometers per hour. Within 12 minutes, the entire strike package was airborne, forming up at 20,000 feet. The EA-18 Golf Growlers led the way, their powerful jamming pods flooding the remaining Iranian communication frequencies with electronic white noise, effectively isolating the naval base at Bandar Abbas from the outside world. The flight toward the target took 25 minutes. The pilots flew in total radio silence, using infrared sensors to navigate the jagged coastline. Below them, the Iranian port was a cluster of lights, and the dark shapes of warships moored at the concrete piers. The Tomahawk Tide had done its job. Not a single radar-guided surface-to-air missile rose to meet them. The FA-18 fighters split into 3 divisions, each assigned to a specific pier or hardened bunker. The lead pilot of Strike 1 pushed his stick forward, diving toward the primary pier where 2 Iranian frigates were tied up. He toggled his master arm to the on position and selected the GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition. The trigger was squeezed. The 2,000-pound bomb separated from the wing with a heavy mechanical clunk, its guidance fins snapping open as it plummeted toward the dark silhouette of the first frigate. The bomb punched straight through the frigate's helicopter deck and detonated deep in the aft engine room. The explosion was a massive, white-hot eruption that lifted the 3,500-ton ship 2 meters out of the water before it slammed back down, its hull split open like a discarded tin can. The shockwave from the blast shattered every window in the nearby port control tower and threw Iranian sailors off the decks of neighboring vessels. On the second frigate, the crew scrambled toward their manual 20mm anti-aircraft guns, opening a frantic but aimless fire into the night sky. Tracers arced upward in beautiful, lethal ribbons of red light. But the FA-18 was already pulling 6 Gs into a vertical climb, the heat from its twin engines shimmering in the darkness. The first frigate was now a roaring furnace of orange flame and black smoke that rose 500 meters into the air, the smell of burning oil and scorched metal reaching even the pilots in their pressurized cockpits. By 6:55 in the evening, the entire naval facility was a landscape of destruction. 6 Iranian patrol boats had been pulverized at their moorings. The central fuel farm was a series of massive, interconnected fireballs that cast a hellish red glow over the city of Bandar Abbas. The EA-18 Golf Growlers continued their orbit, ensuring that no coordinated response could be organized. The American pilots turned their aircraft south, heading back toward the carrier strike group as the first reports of the damage were transmitted via satellite. The strike had been a clinical demonstration of carrier-based air power. In less than 10 minutes of combat, the primary naval base of the Iranian Navy had been effectively neutralized. The ships that had supported the submarine, Tarek, were either at the bottom of the harbor or were burning hulks that would take years to repair. The FA-18 fighters crossed the coastline at supersonic speed, their afterburners leaving long, white streaks against the stars. The admiral aboard the USS Gerald R watched the live infrared feed from a high-altitude drone. He saw the piers engulfed in flames and the secondary explosions as the Iranian ammunition dumps cooked off. The strategic objective for Phase 3 had been achieved. The naval infrastructure of the enemy was broken. He ordered the recovery of the aircraft and began the planning for the final phase of the operation, the clearing of the shipping lanes to restore the flow of global energy. The night was far from over, but the balance of power in the Strait of Hormuz had shifted irrevocably. The United States Navy had delivered a blow that was both heavy and precise, a professional accounting for the loss of the USS Cole. As the first fighters touched down on the carrier deck, the crews worked with the same disciplined speed to refuel and rearm. Vigilance remained the order of the day, even in the shadow of a decisive victory. 7:30 in the morning on the second day of the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, usually the busiest maritime artery in the world, had become a ghost town of stagnant water and drifting oil slicks. Global oil prices had spiked 30% overnight, as insurance companies refused to cover any merchant hull entering the region. To break the economic stranglehold, the United States Navy initiated the most dangerous phase of the operation: the clearing of a safe transit corridor through waters seeded with Iranian naval mines. Leading the effort were the Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, MCM-11, USS Gladiator, and MCM-3, USS Sentry. These vessels, constructed with hulls of wood and glass-reinforced plastic to minimize their magnetic signature, moved at a crawl of only 4 knots. The air over the water was already searing, the temperature climbing toward 105 degrees. The smell of the sea was a foul mix of salt, rotting kelp, and the heavy chemical scent of the diesel fuel still leaking from the sunken Iranian submarine Tarek. Every sailor on the deck of the USS Gladiator wore a life vest and a helmet, their eyes scanning the water for the telltale glint of a floating contact mine. However, the greater threat lay on the seabed. Iranian forces had deployed the EM-52, a sophisticated bottom-moored mine that utilized acoustic, magnetic, and pressure sensors to identify its target. These weapons sat in the dark silt, waiting for the specific vibration of a large hull to trigger their 300-pound high-explosive warheads. From the aft deck of the Sentry, a Sea Fox unmanned undersea vehicle was lowered into the water. This small, orange-colored drone was tethered to the ship by a fiber-optic cable, its high-definition sonar and cameras providing a real-time feed to the operators in the combat center. The Sea Fox navigated through the murky, green water at coordinates 26 degrees, 35 minutes north, 56 degrees, 12 minutes east. The sonar operator, a mineman first class, sat in a climate-controlled booth that hummed with the sound of cooling fans, his hands steady on a pair of joysticks. "Contact, contact," the operator announced, his voice low and professional. "Object is cylindrical, approximately 2 meters in length. It is partially buried in the silt. Signature matches an EM-52 naval mine." The Sea Fox was maneuvered to within 3 meters of the mine. A small, shaped charge, known as a neutralizer, was deployed from the drone and attached to the mine's casing using a magnetic clamp. The drone then backed away to a safe distance. At 7:55 in the morning, the order was given to detonate. A muffled, low-frequency boom shook the hull of the USS Sentry, and a massive dome of white water erupted 200 meters off the starboard bow. Dead fish and plumes of black mud floated to the surface as the mine was neutralized, its threat to shipping erased in a single flash of chemical energy. While the ships worked the seabed, the air was filled with the rhythmic thrum of 3 MH-53 Sierra Sea Dragon helicopters. These massive aircraft, the largest in the United States inventory, were towing the Mark I 105 magnetic minesweeping sleds. The sleds skimmed across the surface of the water, generating a massive electromagnetic field that simulated the signature of a large tanker. This influence sweeping was designed to trick the mines into detonating early, clearing wide swaths of the strait in a fraction of the time required for individual drone operations. The work was slow and nerve-wracking. Over the course of 6 hours, the mine-clearing team neutralized 14 separate mines. The heat on the open decks was punishing, and the constant threat of a sudden explosion beneath the hull kept every man and woman at a state of peak tension. The air smelled of salt spray and the hot, ozone-heavy scent of the specialized electrical equipment used to find the hidden killers. Despite the danger, the corridor slowly began to take shape, a 3-mile-wide lane of cleared water that would eventually allow the world's economy to breathe again. However, the Iranian military was not content to watch their minefields be dismantled. At 10:15 in the morning, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye detected a surge in activity at the small Iranian port of Qeshm. Dozens of high-speed signatures were moving toward the clearing area. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was launching a swarm of fast attack craft, armed with shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns, in a desperate attempt to sink the vulnerable, wooden-hulled minesweepers. The commanding officer of the USS Gladiator looked toward the northern horizon. Through his binoculars, he could see the white rooster tails of the incoming boats. He knew his ship, armed only with 250 caliber machine guns, could not survive a swarm attack. He keyed his radio to the strike group's tactical net. "This is Gladiator. We have multiple inbound surface hostiles. Request immediate air support. We are stationary and unable to maneuver." The reply from the USS Gerald R. Ford was instantaneous. "Gladiator, this is Ford. We have 2 flights of Super Hornets inbound. Help is 3 minutes out. Hold your station." The battle for the strait was no longer happening in the deep or in the bunkers on shore. It was moving to the surface, where the slow, professional work of the minesweepers was about to be interrupted by the chaotic violence of a swarm engagement. The corridor was only half finished, and the cost of completing it was about to rise. 10:30 in the morning. The horizon to the north of the mine-clearing corridor was suddenly broken by 32 white rooster tails of spray, each representing an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack craft. These vessels, some no longer than 15 meters, were powered by triple outboard engines that allowed them to skim across the surface of the Strait of Hormuz at speeds exceeding 50 knots. They moved in a swarm formation, a chaotic and overlapping pattern designed to saturate the defenses of the United States Navy's slower, more vulnerable minesweepers. The air over the strait was a shimmering wall of heat, reaching 41 degrees Celsius. The smell of salt was joined by the sharp, chemical odor of high-octane gasoline as the Iranian boats closed the distance to the USS Gladiator and the USS Sentry. On the decks of the minesweepers, sailors manned their M250 caliber machine guns, the heavy brass cartridges clicking into place with a sound of mechanical finality. But the primary defense for the minesweepers was already descending from the sky. A flight of 4 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford, arrived on station within 3 minutes of the first alarm. They were joined by the littoral combat ship LCS-8, USS Montgomery, which had been loitering 10 miles to the south. The Montgomery was designed specifically for this type of asymmetric, shallow water combat. Its 4 water jets, allowing it to maneuver with the agility of a racing boat despite its 3,000-ton displacement. The engagement turned kinetic at 10:42 in the morning. The lead Iranian boat, a Swedish-built Boghummer patrol craft, ignored the warning shots, fired into the water, and raised a shoulder-fired rocket launcher toward the USS Sentry. The trigger was squeezed by a United States Navy door gunner aboard the lead MH-60 Sierra. A single AGM-114 Hellfire missile shrieked off the helicopter's pylon, propelled by a solid fuel motor that left a pencil-thin trail of white smoke against the blue sky. The heat from the launch washed into the helicopter's cabin, carrying the acrid scent of burnt nitrate. The Hellfire missile, guided by a laser designator from the helicopter's nose-mounted sensor ball, punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead Iranian boat just above the waterline. The 8-kilogram shaped charge warhead detonated instantly, igniting the 300 gallons of gasoline stored in the boat's internal tanks. The vessel did not merely catch fire. It erupted in a spectacular, white-hot fireball that rose 20 meters into the air. Jagged fragments of the hull and pieces of the outboard engines were sent flying in every direction, skip-wheeling across the surface of the water like lethal stones. The remaining 31 Iranian boats reacted by breaking their tight formation, scattering in a starburst pattern to evade further missile strikes. Several boats began to return fire, their 12.7mm heavy machine guns stitching lines of white foam across the water toward the USS Montgomery. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical hammering that echoed off the steel sides of the American ship. One Iranian boat commander attempted a high-speed run toward the USS Gladiator, but he was intercepted by the Montgomery's 30mm Mark 44 Bushmaster II chain gun. The American ship's stabilized gun system fired a burst of 5 armor-piercing rounds. The shells, each the size of a large soda bottle, shredded the Iranian boat's control console and severed the fuel lines in a single second of fire. The boat veered wildly to the left, its engines screaming as they hit maximum revolutions before exploding in a cloud of black smoke and oily steam. The crew of the boat was thrown into the water, where they disappeared beneath the churning wake of their own vessel. By 11 in the morning, the swarm had been broken. 8 Iranian craft were either sinking or were stationary, burning wrecks. The remaining 24 boats, realizing that the combination of aerial, surveillance, and rapid-fire naval gunnery was insurmountable, turned back toward the safety of the Iranian coast. They left behind a battlefield littered with floating debris, smoldering life vests, and the iridescent sheen of spilled fuel. The United States Navy had maintained the integrity of the mine-clearing corridor without losing a single sailor or sustaining damage to its wooden-hulled minesweepers. The silence that followed the engagement was heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, fading thrum of the retreating outboard engines. The air smelled of gunpowder and the ozone of the Montgomery's electronic warfare suites. The minesweepers, which had paused their operations during the height of the fire, immediately resumed their slow, methodical crawl. The Sea Fox drones were lowered back into the water, and the search for the final hidden second killers on the seabed continued. The Admiral in Bahrain received the report of the engagement at 11:15 in the morning. He noted that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had attempted to escalate the conflict to the surface and had failed decisively. The message was clear. The United States would not be deterred by swarm tactics. Operation Vigilant Cohort was entering its final hours. The corridor was nearly open, and the strategic objective of restoring international shipping was within reach. 2 in the afternoon on the 3rd day of the operation, the air inside the flag briefing room of the USS Gerald R Ford was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and electronic ozone. The massive digital maps that had dominated the walls for 72 hours were now static, displaying a comprehensive battle damage assessment of Operation Vigilant Cohort. Admiral Marcus Vance stood at the head of the mahogany table, reviewing a thick folder of satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The campaign was reaching its conclusion, and the time for a professional, clinical accounting of the costs and results had arrived. The United States Navy had achieved every primary strategic objective. At the top of the list was the total restoration of maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz. At exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, the first commercial supertanker, the British Sovereign, had safely transited the mine-cleared corridor, escorted by the destroyer DDG-51 USS Arleigh Burke. The global energy markets, which had been in a state of near collapse, began to stabilize as the first barrels of crude oil moved toward international waters. The maritime chokepoint was officially open for business. The cost to the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy was catastrophic. The casualty assessment, written in cold and precise spoken English, detailed the systematic dismantling of their regional power. One Kilo-class submarine, the Tarek, rested on the seabed at a depth of 85 meters, its entire crew of 52 personnel presumed lost. Two Alvin-class frigates were total losses, sitting at the bottom of the Bandar Abbas naval basin. In the surface swarm engagement, 12 fast attack craft had been destroyed, with another 6 heavily damaged and out of commission. On the shore, the destruction was equally thorough. The Tomahawk cruise missile strikes had neutralized 4 long-range radar sites and 6 HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. The central command and control bunker at Bandar Abbas had been reduced to a scorched concrete shell, effectively severing the head of the Iranian naval leadership in the region. Total Iranian military casualties were estimated at 340 personnel killed and over 600 wounded. The infrastructure that had allowed for the unprovoked attack on the USS Cole had been erased from the map. The United States forces had not emerged unscathed, and the report acknowledged the loss with somber honesty. The destroyer, DDG-67, USS Cole, remained the heaviest price paid. While the ship had been saved from sinking by the heroic efforts of its damage control teams, the structural damage was extreme. 17 United States sailors had been killed in the initial torpedo impact, and another 39 were treated for serious injuries, ranging from flash burns to blunt force trauma. The ship was currently being towed toward the dry docks at Naval Station Rota for a multi-year reconstruction. Beyond the loss of life on the Cole, the United States Navy recorded the loss of one MH-60 Sierra helicopter, which had suffered a mechanical failure during a low-altitude night transition. Though both pilots were successfully rescued, there were no losses among the FA-18 strike fighters or the cruise missile platforms. The professional discipline of the carrier strike group had ensured that, despite the high-intensity combat, American losses were kept to an absolute minimum while delivering a maximum weight of fire. The atmosphere in the briefing room was not one of celebration, but of professional satisfaction. The United States military had demonstrated that it could absorb a surprise blow and respond with a speed and scale that the enemy had clearly failed to anticipate. The iron flow of logistics had proven that the strike group could maintain combat operations indefinitely, while the precision of the Tomahawk Tide and the airstrikes had shown that no hardened target was beyond the reach of American power. At 3 in the afternoon, Admiral Vance signed the final mission summary. The report would be flashed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the White House within the hour. The strategic result was clear. Deterrence had been restored through the decisive application of force. The Iranian Navy was no longer a functional combat entity in the Persian Gulf, and the United States Navy had re-established its position as the guarantor of international maritime law. Outside, on the flight deck, the sun was beginning to set, casting a long, golden light across the rows of parked aircraft. The air was calm, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic hum of the carrier's nuclear reactors. The high-intensity phase of Operation Vigilant Cohort was over. The task now shifted from combat to the long, quiet watch of a superpower that had reminded the world exactly why its presence in these waters was non-negotiable. 5 in the afternoon on the 4th day. The Strait of Hormuz was bathed in a long, amber light. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the fleet ocean tug TATF 168 USS Catawba moved at a slow and steady 6 knots. The thick nylon towing hawser strained tight between its stern and the bow of the crippled destroyer DDG-67 USS Cole. The destroyer sat low and heavy in the water, its port side still bearing the jagged, blackened scar where the Iranian torpedoes had struck 72 hours earlier. The air was finally beginning to cool, though it remained thick, with the scent of salt and the lingering oily residue of the naval engagements. Surrounding the tow was a massive protective screen, consisting of 2 Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers and a littoral combat ship, their radar systems scanning the air and water for any sign of a final, desperate Iranian sortie. But the Iranian coast remained silent. The fires at Bandar Abbas had been extinguished, leaving behind only the twisted skeletons of the naval base and the heavy silence of a defeated force. On the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, which maintained a parallel course 5 miles to the south, the entire crew had been called to quarters. 2,000 sailors and Marines stood in silent, perfect formation, their white uniforms a stark contrast against the dark non-skid surface of the deck. In the center of the formation, 17 pairs of black leather boots were lined up in a perfect row. Beside each pair of boots stood an M4 carbine, its bayonet fixed and pointed toward the steel-gray sky, a helmet resting on its buttstock. The memorial service was brief and somber. The ship's chaplain spoke of the sacrifice made by the 17 sailors of the USS Cole. Their names read aloud, into the wind, one by one. As each name was spoken, a bell was struck on the hangar deck, the clear, metallic ring carrying across the water to the other ships in the strike group. The ceremony concluded with a 21-gun salute, the sharp cracks of the rifles echoing off the superstructure of the carrier before being swallowed by the vastness of the Arabian Sea. The strategic reality of the region had been fundamentally altered. The United States Navy had transitioned from a policy of presence to one of active dominance. As part of the conclusion of Operation Vigilant Cohort, the Pentagon announced a permanent increase in the naval forces assigned to the United States Fifth Fleet. A minimum of 2 Aegis-equipped destroyers would now be stationed within the Strait of Hormuz at all times, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The freedom of navigation would no longer be a diplomatic request. It would be a condition enforced by the most advanced surface combatants in the world. The USS Cole reached the open waters of the Gulf of Oman at 6:30 in the evening, clearing the narrowest part of the chokepoint. From there, it would begin the long journey back to the United States, first stopping at a heavy-lift ship for transport across the Atlantic. The ship was broken, but it had survived. The engineering reports indicated that the hull was structurally sound enough for the transit, and the Navy had already committed to a $500 million modernization program to return the ship to the front lines. The Cole would live to fight again, a floating testament to American damage control and the resilience of its crew. By 8 in the evening, the first night of the new normal had begun. The USS Gerald R. Ford turned its bow into the wind, launching a routine combat air patrol of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets. These aircraft would circle the strait throughout the night, their infrared sensors and AN/APG-79 radars, ensuring that the shipping lanes remained clear. The merchant traffic had resumed in earnest, with over 40 supertankers and cargo ships following the Arleigh Burke-class escorts through the cleared corridor. The heartbeat of global commerce was pulsing once more. The final report for Operation Vigilant Cohort was transmitted to Washington at 9 in the evening. It was a document of 312 pages, detailing every missile fired, every gallon of fuel burned, and every target destroyed. But the most important part of the report was the final sentence, which noted that the sovereign waters of the United States and the international lanes of the Strait of Hormuz were once again secure. The Iranian Navy had attempted to close the door on the world, and the United States Navy had kicked it open with overwhelming and righteous force. As the moon rose over the Persian Gulf, casting a pale, shivering light across the wakes of the moving fleet, the sense of tension that had gripped the region for 3 days finally began to lift. The sailors on watch in the combat information centers remained at their stations, their eyes on the screens, their fingers near the triggers. Vigilance was the price of peace, and it was a price the United States Navy was prepared to pay indefinitely. The war that had begun in the dark at 4:17 in the morning was over, and the message sent to those who would challenge the freedom of the seas had been delivered with absolute clarity.